The champagne had barely stopped flowing when Margaret Whitmore leaned in close during our first dance, her perfectly manicured fingers gripping my shoulder just a little too tightly. Her smile was radiant for the cameras, but her words cut through me like ice. "You're just a guest here, dear," she whispered, her breath smelling of expensive wine and malice. "Don't forget that." I stumbled slightly, my new husband David spinning me away before I could respond. According to YouTube analytics, 99.3% of viewers are not subscribed. That's a huge number. By subscribing the channel that is completely free, you'll help support the channel and never miss fresh content. But those words echoed in my mind long after the last guest had gone home, long after we'd collapsed into bed in our honeymoon suite, exhausted but happy. Or so I thought. My name is Sarah Chen, and I had just married into one of the most prominent families in Millbrook. The Whitmores owned half the town, the country club, the largest law firm, several restaurants, and most importantly, the sprawling estate where David had grown up and where we would now be living. At least, that's what I thought. I should have seen the signs earlier. The way Margaret's smile never quite reached her eyes when she looked at me. The subtle correction she made to our wedding plans. "Oh, Sarah dear, wouldn't white roses be more appropriate than those gaudy peonies you picked?" The way she'd insisted on approving the guest list, cutting out several of my college friends because they wouldn't fit the aesthetic. But I was in love, and David seemed oblivious to his mother's passive aggression. He'd grown up in her shadow, accepting her control as normal. "She just wants everything to be perfect," he'd say whenever I brought up her behavior. "She loves me, and she'll love you too, once she gets to know you better." The next morning, I woke up early in our new bedroom, the one Margaret had decorated in shades of beige and cream that made me feel like I was living in a museum. David was already gone. He'd mentioned something about an early meeting with a client. I padded downstairs in my silk pajamas, expecting to find the kitchen empty. Instead, I found Margaret sitting at the massive granite island, fully dressed and made up despite the early hour, sipping coffee from delicate china. She looked me up and down with barely concealed disdain. "Good morning," I said carefully, moving toward the coffee maker. "I hope you slept well in my house," she replied, emphasizing the word "my" just enough to make her meaning clear. I paused, my hand on the coffee pot. "Our house," I corrected gently. "David and I live here now." Margaret's laugh was like wind chimes in a hurricane, pretty on the surface but with an underlying harshness that made me shiver. "Oh, sweetheart, David may have gotten married, but this is still my home. You're welcome to stay as long as you remember your place." "And what place is that?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. "A guest. A temporary one. If you're smart." The words hit me like a physical blow. I'd given up my apartment, my independence, my life as I knew it to merge it with David's. I'd assumed we'd be partners, equals in our new marriage. But looking at Margaret's cold smile, I realized how naive I'd been. "Does David know how you feel?" I asked. "David knows what's best for him. He always has. And what's best for him is maintaining the family legacy, not being dragged down by—" She waved her hand dismissively. "Unsuitable connections." I wanted to argue, to defend myself, but something in her tone told me she was just getting started. Over the following days, Margaret's campaign became more aggressive. She rearranged my belongings while I was out, claiming she was optimizing the space. She invited people over without telling me, then introduced me as David's little wife, with a patronizing smile. She criticized everything from my cooking to my career as a freelance graphic designer. "It's so quaint that you have hobbies," she said one evening as I worked on a client project at the kitchen table. "But surely now that you're a Whitmore, you don't need to work." The way she said work made it sound like a dirty word. I looked up from my laptop to find her watching me with those calculating eyes. I enjoy what I do, I replied. And I'm good at it. I'm sure you think so. She moved closer, her voice dropping to that familiar whisper. But David needs a wife who can focus on what matters. The foundation, the charity events, maintaining our social standing. Not someone buried in her little computer all day. That night, I tried talking to David about his mother's behavior, but he was exhausted from work and barely listening. She's just adjusting, he mumbled into his pillow. Give it time. But time wasn't making things better. If anything, Margaret was getting bolder. She started opening my mail, claiming she thought it was addressed to her. She rearranged our social calendar without consulting me, booking us for events I had no interest in attending. She even went through my closet, removing items she deemed inappropriate for a Whitmore woman. The final straw came 3 weeks after our wedding. I came home from a client meeting to find Margaret in our bedroom, packing my clothes into suitcases. "What are you doing?" I demanded. She didn't even look up. "I've prepared the guest room for you. I think it's time you understood your position here. My position is as David's wife. This is our bedroom." Now she did look up, and her smile was razor sharp. "David needs space to think. He's been so stressed lately, and I think having you hovering isn't helping." "Where is he?" "I want to talk to him." "He's at the office." He asked me to handle this delicately. I knew she was lying. David would never ask his mother to move me out of our bedroom without talking to me first. But when I called him, it went straight to voicemail. Text messages went unanswered. By the time he came home that evening, I was installed in the guest room, and Margaret was serving his favorite dinner in the formal dining room. "Sarah, there, you are?" he said when he saw me. "Mother said you thought you might be more comfortable in the guest room for a few days. That's thoughtful of you." I stared at him, then at Margaret, who was watching me with barely concealed triumph. In that moment, I realized that my husband wasn't going to save me from his mother. If anything, he was so conditioned to believe her version of events that he couldn't see what was happening right in front of him. That night, lying alone in the guest room that was apparently now my permanent residence, I made a decision. If Margaret wanted to play games, I could play too. But I wouldn't be playing by her rules. The next morning, I started my research. Margaret Whitmore had built her reputation on being the perfect society wife, the ultimate hostess, the woman who could organize charity events that raised hundreds of thousands of dollars for worthy causes. But perfection, I was about to discover, often has cracks. I began with public records, using skills I'd developed in college journalism courses. The Whitmore Foundation, Margaret's pride and joy, was indeed successful. But as I dug deeper into the financial records, I found some interesting discrepancies. Money that was supposed to go to homeless shelters was being funneled through a series of shell companies. Donations earmarked for children's hospitals were ending up in accounts linked to Margaret's personal investments. It wasn't exactly embezzlement. Margaret was too smart for that. But it was creative accounting that would raise eyebrows if the wrong people found out about it. Or should I say, if the right people found out about it. I spent the next 2 weeks gathering evidence, following paper trails, and documenting everything. I also started paying attention to Margaret's daily routine, her social schedule, her habits. She was a creature of rigid routine, which made her predictable. Every Tuesday, she had lunch at the country club with the other foundation board members. Every Thursday, she got her hair done at an exclusive salon. Every Sunday, she hosted brunch for the family's inner circle. And every day at 3 p.m., she had tea in the conservatory while going through the mail and making her social calls. It was during one of these tea sessions that I made my move. I had prepared carefully. Using my graphic design skills, I'd created a series of documents that looked official. Letterhead from the State Attorney General's office, a fake investigation notice, even a mock warrant for financial records. They wouldn't hold up to serious scrutiny, but they didn't need to. They just needed to be convincing enough for long enough. I waited until Margaret was deep in conversation with her friend Patricia, gossiping about someone's daughter's unfortunate choice in husbands. Then I walked into the conservatory with a manila envelope and a very serious expression. "Margaret," I said, interrupting her mid-sentence. "I'm sorry, but there are some men here to see you. They're from the Attorney General's office." Her face went white. "What? What do they want?" I handed her the envelope with shaking hands, not from nerves, but from the effort it took to contain my satisfaction. They said something about irregularities in the Foundation's financial records. "They asked me to give you this." Margaret's hands trembled as she opened the envelope and read the first document, a notice of investigation into potential misuse of charitable funds. Patricia gasped and immediately excused herself, probably already mentally rehearsing how she'd tell this story at the next bridge game. "This is impossible," Margaret whispered. "I've done nothing wrong." "They're waiting in the front parlor," I said quietly. "They said they need to ask you some questions." Of course, there were no men waiting in the parlor. But Margaret didn't know that. She rushed out, leaving me alone in the conservatory with her tea growing cold and her phone buzzing with incoming calls from Patricia, who was apparently already spreading the news. Margaret spent the next hour searching the house, growing increasingly frantic when she couldn't find the investigators. When she finally called the Attorney General's office, she was told they had no record of any investigation into the Whitmore Foundation. That's when she knew. I was in the kitchen, calmly preparing dinner, when she stormed in. Her perfect composure was completely shattered, her hair mussed, her makeup smeared. "You little bitch!" she hissed. "How dare you?" I looked up from the vegetables I was chopping, keeping my expression neutral. "I'm sorry, I don't know what you mean. Don't play innocent with me. That fake investigation notice, those documents, you made them." I set down my knife and turned to face her fully. "Margaret, I think you're having some kind of breakdown. Should I call David?" Her face contorted with rage. "You think you're so clever, don't you? But you have no idea who you're dealing with." "Actually," I said, my voice remaining perfectly calm, "I know exactly who I'm dealing with. A woman who's been stealing from charity while playing the perfect society matron. A woman who's so threatened by her son's happiness that she's willing to destroy his marriage. A woman who's about to find out what happens when she underestimates someone." Margaret stepped closer, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You're nothing. A nobody from nowhere who got lucky enough to trick my son into marriage. You don't belong in this family, and you never will." I smiled then, the same kind of cold smile she'd been giving me for weeks. "You're right about one thing. I am nothing like this family. I actually have integrity." That's when she slapped me. The sound echoed through the kitchen like a gunshot. My cheek burned, but I didn't flinch. Instead, I pulled out my phone and showed her the screen. I'd been recording our entire conversation. "Thank you," I said pleasantly. "I was hoping you'd do something like that." Margaret's eyes widened as she realized what I'd done, but before she could react, we heard David's voice calling from the front of the house. "Sarah? Mom? I'm home." Margaret and I stared at each other, both knowing that the next few minutes would change everything. She composed herself with remarkable speed, smoothing her hair and wiping her eyes. "You won't say anything," she said quietly. "You wouldn't dare. Watch me." David walked into the kitchen looking tired but happy to be home. He kissed my cheek, the one that was still stinging from his mother's slap, and smiled at both of us. "How are your days?" he asked innocently. I looked at Margaret, giving her one last chance to come clean, to apologize, to change course. But her expression was defiant, challenging. "Actually, honey," I said, "your mother and I need to talk to you about something important." What happened next was ugly. I played the recording, showed him the evidence of his mother's financial irregularities, and told him about weeks of psychological warfare she'd been waging against me. David listened in stunned silence, his face growing paler with each revelation. Margaret denied everything at first, claiming I was lying, that I'd manipulated the evidence, that I was trying to destroy their family. But the recording was damning, and when David heard his mother's voice calling me a little bitch and describing how she'd been systematically trying to drive me away, something in him finally snapped. "Is this true?" he asked her quietly. Margaret's composure finally cracked completely. "She doesn't belong here," she screamed. "She's not good enough for you, for this family. I was protecting you. By stealing from charity? By abusing my wife? It's not stealing. It's creative financing, and I wasn't abusing anyone. I was trying to make her understand her place." David stood up slowly, and I saw something in his face I'd never seen before. A cold anger that reminded me eerily of his mother. "Her place," he said quietly, "is as my wife. In our home, our bedroom, our life together." He turned to me, and his expression softened. "Sarah, I am so sorry. I should have listened. I should have seen what was happening." "David, please," Margaret pleaded. "She's manipulating you. This is exactly what she wanted, to turn you against your own mother." "No," he said firmly. "What she wanted was to be treated with basic respect in her own home. What she got instead was psychological warfare from someone who should have welcomed her into the family." The confrontation continued for hours. Margaret alternated between denial, justification, and desperate pleading. She promised to change, to accept me, to treat me better. But it was too late. David had finally seen his mother for who she really was, and there was no going back. The aftermath was swift and decisive. Margaret was removed from her position at the foundation pending a real investigation into the financial irregularities I'd uncovered. It turned out that while my fake documents were fabricated, the real financial misconduct I'd discovered was very much genuine. The Attorney General's office did eventually open an investigation, though Margaret avoided criminal charges by agreeing to pay back the misappropriated funds and step down from all her charitable positions. More importantly, at least from my perspective, Margaret was asked to move out of the family home. David, finally freed from his mother's influence, was ruthless in establishing boundaries. She was no longer welcome to enter our house without permission. She was no longer allowed to interfere in our marriage. And she was certainly never again allowed to treat me as anything less than David's equal partner. The social fallout was spectacular. Margaret's carefully constructed reputation crumbled as word spread about both the financial scandal and the family drama. The woman who had once been the undisputed queen of Millbrook society found herself persona non grata at the very events she'd once organized. David and I used the crisis as an opportunity to rebuild our marriage on a stronger foundation. We moved into the master bedroom, our bedroom, and began the process of making the house truly ours. I redecorated, bringing color and warmth to spaces that had felt like museums. We hosted parties for my friends, the ones Margaret had tried to exclude from our wedding. We started new traditions that reflected both of our backgrounds and values. It wasn't easy. David struggled with guilt over confronting his mother, and I had to work through the anger and hurt from those weeks of psychological warfare. We went to counseling, both together and individually, to process what had happened and learn how to communicate better. But we emerged stronger. David learned to see his mother's manipulation for what it was, and I learned to stand up for myself instead of hoping someone else would rescue me. Most importantly, we both learned that marriage means protecting each other, even when that protection comes at the cost of other relationships. Margaret made several attempts to reconcile over the following months. She sent flowers, left voicemails, even showed up at the house a few times before David finally had to threaten her with a restraining order. She couldn't seem to accept that her behavior had consequences, that her son had chosen his wife over his mother's manipulations. The last time I saw her was at David's cousin's wedding 6 months later. She looked smaller somehow, diminished without her court of admirers and her position of social power. She approached me during the reception, when David was distracted talking to relatives. "I hope you're happy," she said quietly. "You've destroyed everything." I looked at her, really looked at her, and felt something I hadn't expected. Pity. This woman had been so terrified of losing control, so threatened by her son's love for someone else, that she destroyed her relationship with him entirely. "I didn't destroy anything," I replied. "I just refused to let you destroy me." She opened her mouth to respond, but David appeared at my side, taking my hand in his. "Mother," he said coolly, "I thought we agreed you wouldn't approach Sarah anymore." Margaret's face crumpled, but she didn't argue. She simply walked away, and I never saw her again. A year later, David and I renewed our vows in a small, intimate ceremony with just our closest friends and family. Margaret wasn't invited. As we exchanged rings again, this time as true partners who had weathered a serious storm together, I thought about that night in the guest room when I'd decided to fight back. I could have left. I could have accepted Margaret's assessment that I was just a guest in their world, temporary and disposable. I could have let her win. Instead, I'd chosen to stand my ground, to fight for my marriage and my dignity. It hadn't been easy, and it hadn't been pretty. But it had been necessary. Sometimes people need to learn that their actions have consequences. Sometimes the only way to deal with a bully is to show them you're not afraid to fight back. And sometimes, the person you thought would never stand up for you just needs to see the truth clearly enough to make the right choice. Margaret had whispered that I was just a guest in her house. But she was wrong. I wasn't a guest anymore. I was home. And no one, not even a mother-in-law with a heart full of poison, was going to take that away from me. The house was finally, truly, ours.